Hello, Internet. We're Uncommon Loot. My name's Eddie.
I'm Ian.
And I'm Steven.
And we really like talking to you about video games and playing video games for you and all of this fun stuff. And we hope that you like us doing that. You know what would really help us to be able to do more of that? Is if you shared this video and any of our videos with two of your friends.
And then they'll share with two of their friends.
And those two friends can share with their two friends.
And then their two friends will share with two more friends.
Those two more friends can share with two more friends.
And then those two friends, you know what they'll do?
Will they share with two more friends?
Oh my god, they'll totally share with two more friends.
Okay, this is getting out of hand. Everybody understands the concept of exponentiation.
What's exponentiation?
Exponentiation is a mathematical operation written as b to the n involving two numbers, the base b and the exponent n. When n is positive integer, exponentiation corresponds to the repeated multiplication of the base b.
That was really boring, Eddie.
It's multiplying by powers, yo. We know it. We know it. We do it. Everybody gets it.
Okay. Sure.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Share the video. Make us popular. We want to be internet famous.
Just two friends, guys.
Just two friends. I'm sorry.
All right, guys. Welcome to the podcast. This is for July the 8th?
8th.
Yes, this will be coming out on July the 8th.
Assuming I don't fuck that up.
Yeah, assuming we don't fuck that up, which is, I mean, who knows? Who knows with us, to be honest? We're professionals.
Yeah.
Super professional.
But anyways,
Mistakes.
never make mistakes. Not at all. Not us.
Not once.
No. But anyways, so today we're going to talk a little bit about something that showed up on the internets this week.
It certainly wasn't video games, because nothing happened since E3.
Yeah, I mean, the news has been relatively slow. But we saw this little gem, and it kind of brought our imaginations to life a little bit. And the thing that we're talking about is the Nintendo PlayStation. Yeah, Nintendo PlayStation.
Yeah.
that thing is a collector's dream.
It really is.
Technically assuming it's true. Nobody can prove it, and Shu Yoshida refuses to tell the truth.
Yeah, he just says he will not confirm or deny it because he feels it kind of just is nice to leave the mystery alive.
Yeah, he's being cagey, and I'm assuming that anybody else that worked at PlayStation at the appropriate time will follow his lead on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but anyways, so what we started talking about when we got the pictures in our hands and we had a chance to see everything was, what if this actually happened? Like, what if Sony and Nintendo's merger or partnership worked out? Like,
Right.
Eddie, you want to talk about the dealings a little bit?
Yeah, so I was just about to say, like, let's get some backstory for those that,
go ahead.
that don't know.
You're our explainer. Eddie.
Yeah,
Back in the early 90s, Nintendo was fucking amazing. Everybody goddamn loved everything that they did, and they were getting ready to release a new system, and in 1992, we got the Super Nintendo. But while they were working on the Super Nintendo, they had struck a deal with Sony to make a disk drive, a CD-based add-on. Everybody knew that CDs were the wave of the future, except apparently Nintendo, but they kind of did. So they were like, Sony, make us a disk drive that we can put on the Super Nintendo to make better games. And Sony started working on it, and they'd actually gotten to the point, supposedly, according to rumor, of making 200 prototypes. Then they announced that they were releasing the thing, Sony did, at CES, while Nintendo was talking to Philips about maybe having Philips do it instead.
Why was Nintendo talking to Philips instead of Sony when they already had the partnership going?
Because Sony had struck some sort of deal, the details of which are obviously not super known, but basically it had something to do with Sony wanting some control over games put out on the disk drive, and Nintendo was like, no, let's see if we can get this shittier company to do a better deal for us.
Yeah. Basically, Nintendo didn't like how much control Sony wanted and wanted to see if they could get a better deal.
Yeah, I'm
Right.
assuming that Sony just, even with just getting a little bit of control, Nintendo would not have been happy with that at all.
Right.
They
So,
like to completely have ownership over everything.
the history in the real world, as we know, Nintendo got pissed. They broke off the deal with Sony. Sony went on to make the PlayStation. Philips made a shitty CDI, which ruined a bunch of Nintendo franchises for a little bit. Nintendo completely ignored disc-based
But-
systems for
but-
an extra 10 years.
By the way, guys, I just want to say that I'm really, really hungry and that I could eat a whole Octorok right now.
God
Damn it.
Oh, terrible references.
We don't make mistakes,
notwithstanding.
Ian. We don't make mistakes like mentioning these things. God damn it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Eddie, edit that out, please.
Terrible references notwithstanding. We were curious, what if Nintendo hadn't talked to Philips? Or what if they had immediately shut it down and they just said, you know what, fuck it, Sony announced it, let's go with it. Let's roll it. Let's
roll this thing out. Let's
see what
actually
happens.
release it.
And they decided to just be chill about the whole thing.
So we're going to hop into our time machine.
Or what ifs.
Yeah, or our what if machine, and we're gonna kind of talk about it a
It
little bit.
looks a lot like our transmogrifier.
Yeah, they're
Just
kind
turn
of
it
the
on
same machine.
Turn it on the side.
Yeah, they're kind of the same machine. You just turn the dial the other way and then lay it on its side, and it works.
And voila.
Voila. So let's talk about what happens if they release it. So who's the console powerhouses at this time? Like when Sony and Nintendo are talking about doing this, who has consoles out that people are buying?
It's Nintendo and Sega at the moment.
Pretty much.
And Atari have they released
Well-
the Jaguar by this point?
No, I mean, other companies are working on stuff. Atari's working on the Jaguar, which would come out shortly after the PlayStation was scheduled. It would have come out. Sega had the Genesis, and they were eventually working on their own CD drives.
Yeah,
So
they had the Sega CD
Yeah, I think
on
they
the way.
had the Sega CD, and I think they also were working on the 32X.
Yeah, it's possible they would have rushed both of those, or one or the other, or something. And then Neo Geo actually put out a system around the same time that was like the Jaguar, just stupidly overpriced
Yeah.
and a bad system.
The market
Yeah.
was just absolutely flooding right around
Yeah.
then.
Yeah, there were a lot of different consoles, including, Philips CDI wouldn't have
Yeah.
existed. Like, that wouldn't have been a problem. So, we'll assume that the people with bad business plans would have stayed bad business plans, and then it would have just been Nintendo and Sega, really, kind of
Yeah.
in an arms race.
Yeah, honestly, the Neo Geo was just and Jaguar were both so expensive and so esoteric that honestly, they were never gonna.
They weren't gonna succeed. So then, Sega and Nintendo are competing, but Nintendo also has the backing of Sony, who is at this time already known as an innovator in the electronic space.
Right.
They've come out with the Walkman and many other innovations before that. The Walkman is probably the most prominent one at this point that's in everyone's mind. Mm-hmm. And so people already have a trust for what they're doing electronically, and people trust Nintendo for games.
Yeah, so this is a perfect idea. So then let's pause it. I think what would have happened is it really would have been an add-on. So the Super Nintendo comes out in 1992. The first year or so is probably fairly similar to what we got. You get a Mario World launch title. Everybody fucking buys it. Everybody loves it because it's freaking amazing. But then, rather than eventually making Mario All-Stars, or maybe they do anyway, we get the disc drive. And the disc drive probably comes with Mario All-Stars instead, but remastered to CD quality.
Right.
That'd be pretty sweet.
Yeah, and based off of, so Sony has a little bit of control. We're going to assume that Nintendo's we're running with it. We're giving Sony the little bit of control that they want.
Yeah.
So Sony wants to come out with something that's new and exclusive for the disc drive, but Nintendo wants to kind of keep its franchises. Do those two companies come to some sort of solution with that, Ian? What do you think?
I'm gonna say, because we're basically just going off of they stay together.
Yeah.
I made two separate timelines.
Ian's got a whole whole timeline
It's
thing
like,
going on.
If you
It's
thought
really
the Zelda
detailed.
timeline was convoluted, oh man, this thing is
Yeah,
I
great.
mean, if
Ian's
you've ever seen a grade school map around the room where kids are trying to calculate pi to the farthest thing that they can go, and they keep going, that's what Ian's timeline looks like wrapped around this room right now.
Oh yeah.
So I don't know. I think let's look at all of them. Let's for now, let's hypothesize that Sony and Nintendo become besties, and they just keep going, and everything works out amazingly.
So like you were saying before, like Sony is so well known in the electronics like department that people are pretty much, if they see Nintendo and Sony together doing the same thing, like gamers are just gonna flock to that. And the thing's probably gonna sell like crazy whether it ends up being good or not.
Well, I mean, if you think about it as an add-on, also the Super Nintendo already had a large install base. Like the Super Nintendo ended up winning that generation without a CD disc drive.
Right.
So the CD disc drive as an add-on is kind of just an extra piece.
Yeah, so I think what would have happened is Sony, with their extra creative control, would have end up showcasing a game specific for the hardware, like sort of like how Nintendo had Star Fox that was boasting the FX chip. We would probably get something more advanced like that.
So this is the biggest catch, is that we would have to assume, for it to be anything other than a gimmick that doesn't go anywhere, we have to assume that Sony put their own Super FX type chip that does 3D rendering into the disk drive add-on.
Yeah, we would have to assume that. We'd have to assume that it's going to be basically as powerful as the PlayStation once it's equipped to the Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to be that, because that's what Sony ends up releasing. You have to assume that basically Sony released the PlayStation because of the fact that they're like, hey, we've already done all the work. Why not just put it out?
Which,
like,
by the way,
it won't take much effort.
Just that alone says that we definitely would have gotten Star Fox 2, because I don't know if everyone here knows, but Star Fox 2 was like 95% complete.
Yeah.
And they canned it because they decided that they didn't want to put out another Star Fox game when they could be working on a Star Fox game for their next system that would be more able to handle Star Fox.
Yeah, so they put out Star Fox 2 in its 32-bit glory.
Yeah, and I mean it's not as good as Star Fox 64, obviously.
Right, but they put it out.
But it probably would have been better than just a regular Star Fox 2. Like, it would have had better, more clear graphics. It probably would have been something like a PlayStation. It would have looked like a PlayStation 1 Star Fox.
Yeah.
Like a PlayStation 1 Star Fox.
So assuming that, because doing 3D, especially at that time, was really, really, really difficult. Like, as we saw, people didn't really start being able to handle 3D until
like
long
95.
long into the Nintendo 64's lifespan is when people really got a hold of 3D. So this is where I kind of think that things take a turn where either Sony actually figures out what they're doing and they find a way to make a 3D system look appealing and sell well, and it's basically the Nintendo 64 but earlier,
right,
and a little less powerful, and that works and that sells, and then eventually they make another system together. I think that down that line, that Nintendo and Sony would eventually maybe possibly merge or go into further dealings.
That honestly would make sense to me, because it would, in my opinion, I think it would have been incredibly successful.
Yeah.
I think that they would have been so successful that they might have even pushed Sega out of the market sooner.
But
sooner than they did, because like, how do you compete with that? Like, how do you compete with those?
They might, like, Sega might have had the time to. They wouldn't have wasted time on the 32X or the Sega CD. They might have just jumped straight to something like the Dreamcast and actually been able to compete better, because it wasn't until, like, remember, the original PlayStation was what spurred Sega to start developing things like the Saturn and the Dreamcast.
That's true.
And unfortunately, they had already spent so much time developing the 32X that they didn't really have any time to make a proper 3D polygonal system.
That's why everything hinges on the success of the Nintendo PlayStation. Like, because like I was saying, 3D was such a hard thing to do back then. If Sony honestly might not have been able to figure out a good way to pull it off. It might have happened and then been really similar to the 32X or the Sega CD or the Sega Saturn and just not be very impressive.
Or every other Nintendo peripheral that ends up being thrown to the wayside.
Or every other Nintendo peripheral. And
in that case, Sony probably never gets into the games market, like, after that, right?
Yeah,
right.
So this is where it splits. So there's at least two timelines that I really want to talk about. One where it's successful and one where it's not.
So let's stick to the successful
I think there's
side,
actually
right?
2 possible timelines where it's not successful, but we'll get to that
Yeah,
later.
we'll get to that later also. But so let's stick to the successful side. So we know we see Mario continue, Star Fox continues, Metroid continues, all the Nintendo products continue. My thought, though, is that we don't get nearly as many Sony franchises. Like, I don't think God of War ever shows up.
No.
I don't think Nintendo would ever allow... Like, they'd say, sure, you can do games, but I don't think God of War shows up.
Well, here's the question is, what happens to PC without consoles becoming the kind of like mature powerhouse that they are? Because what I think happens is the consoles stay successful, but when Nintendo holds them to children's standards, and then either Sega becomes the Sony that goes for the more adult audience and the more mature gamer, or once we grow up and we get tired of playing Mario over and over and over again and we want something a little different, we buy computers.
I honestly feel like Sega tries to skirt the line between kid-friendly and adult-friendly. I don't think they just go straight up focus on the adults who have the money.
Well, that's what they do for now. But so, okay.
No, what I'm saying is I agree with what you're saying in the fact that Nintendo stays kid-friendly. But I'm saying that I think that the PC would be the route that adult gamers go to get their mature content. Because at this time, that's when they're releasing stuff like the original Warcraft,
right,
the original StarCraft, Civilization. Things like that are already getting popular.
Doom and Wolfenstein. The shooters are getting bigger.
Exactly.
Which is all. The other thing is that 3D graphics, even if the PlayStation that Sony makes with Nintendo doesn't become 3D, I think PCs force 3D graphics to happen sooner or later.
Yeah, I agree.
But my thought is Sega would, like, you say Sega is going to toe the line between kid-friendly and mature system. That's what the original PlayStation did at first.
Yeah.
And then they realized that they can't compete on kid-friendly with Nintendo, and they just started pushing it more mature. That's why we got Sony, this mature adult Sony, is because of that. And so I think that if the Nintendo, PlayStation, and Sony and Nintendo stay kid-friendly, then they just become really fucking good at it. And Sega is forced to adapt to the new environment, and they push their... I mean, they did it with Sonic's attitude already.
I guess that's
It was kind
true.
of like trying to go edgy, and I think Sega becomes the company that goes super hardcore on everything.
I mean, they gave Shadow guns, so...
They gave Shadow guns, like...
Yeah, I mean...
Super edgy.
They could. My thought, though, is just about Sega in general is... they didn't have the courage, I think, to pull the trigger and say, we're not worried about the children anymore. Like, I don't feel that they ever would have. I think they would have been like, well, Sonic was so successful because he was edgy, but he was still basically a kid's character in their mind. Like, he was edgier, more aimed towards preteens and teenagers.
Right.
But he was still for the under 18 audience, the audience that can't afford to buy these systems on their own.
But, and this is the biggest reason that people started developing for PlayStation, is that even with PCs eventually becoming the main thing, consoles for a long time until recently were still much easier to develop for video games, because that's what their dedicated purpose is. They have more ability for graphics and flexibility and things like that. So if Sega makes a proper 3D system in the late 90s, the developer, the creative minds who want to get into the living room market making software that isn't for kids can't go to Sony, because Sony's with Nintendo. So they have to find somebody who has a console that they can make a game for, and the only person available is Sega. So I think the developers would have pushed to give those games. Sega wouldn't have been the ones driving the thing, but somebody would have gone to Sega and been like, hey, I want to make this game. Nintendo says it's too far out there, and Sega's like, oh, Nintendo, fuck Nintendo.
Yeah, we'll take it.
We'll take it. And then they get something like, I don't know, like a Perfect Dark, or not a Perfect Dark, but like a Siphon Filter.
Honestly, like, I think that what could have happened is, you know, around the time shortly after this, around the time of the Dreamcast, is when Microsoft talks about getting into the console space.
Right.
Right. And if Sega is still a powerhouse in it because Sony hasn't pushed them out of the market, I still think that there's always room at least for 2 or 3 consoles, period.
Yeah.
And, like, if Sony and Nintendo are so powerful that they take up the 2 spaces, Sega's still there for 1 space. And I think Microsoft has enough confidence that if they can throw their name into the hat, into the ring, that they can make money. But I feel if Sega's still strong, but not strong enough to compete, that might be a good acquisition for Microsoft.
You think Sega just outright, or Microsoft just outright buys Sega?
Either buys them or does a partnership in the same way that Sony and Nintendo did. Some sort of unholy alliance, which allows them to bring PC architecture to the console space still.
I will say, if something like that happens, it goes the opposite of Sony and Nintendo, where Nintendo was kind of the parent company that, like, Sony comes under their umbrella, and Nintendo retains most of the control. I think if Microsoft and Sega do a partnership, even with any of these changes, Microsoft is still the bigger one.
I agree.
Microsoft, especially in the late 90s, they've got Windows 95. They have so much money. That's when they got sued for having a monopoly, because they had too much money.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that is the situation where if Microsoft ends up talking with Sega and grouping up with Sega, that we have a real, true console, like, competition on our hands, because Microsoft is working in the PC space already. They have Windows, so they allow people to develop mature games for Windows. They have partnerships with developers already. So as you said, if developers want to come to someone, instead of coming to Sega now, who's in Japan and hard to reach, the American developers that sort of pushed the more mature genre, and the European developers who did the same thing, now come to Microsoft, who they have easier access to. Yeah. And they talk to them, and I think you might even get more mature games on this Sega Microsoft amalgam.
Well, sure. I definitely think that if Microsoft buys Sega, that Sega they basically spend money to make Sega be more comfortable with adult games. And then on top of that, already, like, if Microsoft partners with Sega, that bumps up the first-person shooter and the ports from PC to consoles really fast, because Microsoft already has all these games that exist on PC. They make Sega make a PC-like architecture, and then they just go, let's move all these games to your console so people can play them in the living room.
Yeah.
And we'll just make a mint, because these games are already popular.
So, in that situation also, Microsoft, historically, since they've started making consoles, has had a problem getting into the Japanese market. Ian, do you think that they would have any problem? Like, do you think it would be easier for them if maybe they had joined with a Japanese company in Sega?
I think that if that was the case, I think what they would do is they would look into developing a handheld with Sega at the forefront of like making Japanese-oriented games for it, so that way they could strive in Japan a little better.
Yeah, Japan's handheld market has always been more vibrant.
Yes, yeah.
But
that, I think, that comes maybe in the mid-2000s, but I think early on, I think that the real big thing that pushes and makes Microsoft viable in Japan in this alternate universe is the fact that Capcom had a bunch of games that came out on PlayStation that wouldn't have come out.
Yeah, you're right. Like the Resident Evils.
The Resident Evils, Onimusha, Devil May Cry. These are all games that Rising Zon was a different thing. But
I think you guys are all forgetting about Sony saying the creative control. Like, I don't think that they would want to just stay a completely kid-friendly company. I think that if they do get really successful, like we say they do, and they do merge, then I think they would kind of be the best of both worlds, and they would be okay with doing family-friendly things, but also be okay to be the home of more mature games.
This actually is the perfect segue into my third alternate universe that you guys hadn't talked about. Is the Nintendo PlayStation is super successful. Everybody buys it. It proves that disc-based is the future. And then Sony says, let's put darker, more adult games on because video gamers are growing up. And Nintendo says, no. And then Sony says, we can't, we're not going to keep. And that's when Sony breaks off.
So you think there's an alternate universe where Sony still ends up making their own console?
I think there's an alternate universe where Sony gets the vision to see that video games is a successful option, wants to do something more exciting than what Nintendo has, because Nintendo's properties, Sony's always been a way bigger risk taker as a company than Nintendo has. And I can see totally when things are successful and Sony wants to take that success and run with it, and Nintendo goes, no chances. We don't take risks. Sony goes, fine, we'll take a risk. Bye.
I think, honestly, like, that sounds like a legitimate thing that could happen. In that situation, though, basically we lose out on an era of competition between Nintendo and PlayStation, because during the PlayStation era, they're partners, right? And then we end up with a PlayStation 2, PlayStation 2, GameCube still sort of grouping, I guess, and then the Sony still takes off. Like,
Sony makes a system called the GameCube, and it's amazing.
Yeah,
and Nintendo makes a PlayStation 2, and it's terrible.
Yeah, like I feel like that scenario ends up turning out a lot like what's happening right now, except for maybe Sega gets pushed out a little sooner.
Yeah.
Unless that unholy alliance with Microsoft happens, in which case
I don't think that would happen.
That would just throw everything off if Microsoft jumps into the games industry earlier.
Yeah.
But I think that timeline is probably the most probable one.
Yeah, that's
but
what I'm
I think
saying.
it's the least interesting one to talk about.
But I definitely it speaks to a lot that it seems fairly reasonable that Sony making their own video game system, given that Nintendo had already started talking to them about it, was fairly inevitable.
Yeah. So anyways, we'll go back to what Ian was saying though. You think that Nintendo would have, like, based on the success of this, would actually have compromised?
I think that they wouldn't have diluted their brand at all. Like, you're not going to see Mario walking around with guns and, like, slaying dragons or anything.
Right.
But I do think that they would have allowed for other franchises, and I think that with that much, like, firepower under the engine and everything, and all those good things working out for them, I think they would have had massive third-party support. I think that those third parties would have been allowed to make more mature games.
Maybe they turn into something like Sony becomes Nintendo's third-party branch.
Yeah, so that basically Nintendo can be like, well, all of our first-party games are kid-friendly, and and they have the Nintendo logo, Nintendo seal of approval.
Let's not forget that Rareware was allowed to make Conker's Bad Fur Day on the Nintendo 64.
That's true.
That happened.
That's true.
That is true.
As long as it's not Nintendo-specific franchises, they'll allow it if they think that it will appeal to someone and make money.
And to be fair, at the time that they released Conker's Bad Fur Day, Conker felt like a fairly fucking Nintendo-specific franchise.
Yeah, he did. Conker was really really kid-friendly.
Conker came from a Diddy Kong game, which came from Donkey Kong.
Yeah.
Like, that's not too many degrees of separation from hardcore Nintendo Central.
Yeah, and this is coming right after Banjo-Kazooie, if I remember right, or Banjo-Tooie, one of those, after a Banjo game.
Yeah.
And it was originally going to be a kids game, and they're like, you know what? No, we've done enough of those, and then Nintendo gave them the okay to do that.
Like, we don't want to just reskin Banjo with a squirrel.
No, there's the thing, is that I think that because of Rareware's involvement with Nintendo, I don't think that we would have... I think that Sony wouldn't have made a whole lot of other games. Honestly, I don't think that we would have ended up getting Crash Bandicoot, at least not on a Nintendo system.
Yeah, because that would have competed too directly, I think, with Mario and, like, Donkey Kong.
Yeah.
So
I think we would have still gotten it, but I think it would have gone to Sega or Microsoft. Or the Sega-Microsoft amalgam you talk about.
And here's the thing is, I don't think that Microsoft would have tried to partner up with Sega, because they already would be buying up Rare. And the reason that they bought up Rare in the first place is to try and weaken Nintendo. And they would still want to do that, especially if they're that
So you
strong.
think that Microsoft would still buy Rare and jump into the console space in this situation?
Yeah.
What if Microsoft, instead of trying to poach Rare, decides to poach Sony? This is a universe where Sony's disk drives are the reason that Nintendo is still the powerhouse that they are, and Microsoft says if we suck that out from under them.
Well, that's the thing though, is that Sony has a ton of money, and there's no reason for Sony to jump ship to Microsoft. Rare had a reason to jump ship because
they were running out.
Yeah, like Rare was not Japanese; they were, I think, Texas based.
I'm not sure. I know they were. They weren't.
Europe. Sorry.
I think they're European.
Yeah, they're European, and Microsoft could offer a lot more money.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think they would still make that move, and I think that after purchasing Rare, that's when we would start to see other more unique franchises kind of start to come out from Sony. I think that's when Sony would have been more involved with...
So you think basically Microsoft poaches Rare because they want to weaken Nintendo, and what that does is gets Sony to be like, hey, you know what, Nintendo? Yeah, we lost Rare, but we've got a lot of good people, and we believe that they can make good games. If you give us a chance, let us do it.
Mm-hmm. And then, I think that's when we start seeing titles like Jak and Daxter and Ratchet and Clank start showing up on the Nintendo PlayStation. It's after Rare leaves.
Rare leaves, and then they let Naughty Dog, some guys from Burbank or wherever Naughty Dog is from show up. Like Insomniac shows up, and they're talking about these clever creative games that they've got.
Yeah, Insomniac and Naughty Dog show up, and Sony's like, hey guys, join up with us and make this awesome stuff. We've got so many people who could play your games.
Yeah.
Squaresoft never leaves.
Squaresoft never leaves. No, Squaresoft stays. Squaresoft might end up getting purchased by Nintendo, Sony.
Squaresoft just...
There is no Enix anymore. It's not a Square Enix. It's Squaresoft and Enix both get purchased by Nintendo, Sony. And
maybe.
And,
yeah, that's a bigger question.
Yeah. But
you're getting way ahead of ourselves here.
But no, what I'm saying is why would third parties want to go somewhere else if this, alliance happens, and if, Sony finds a way to open Nintendo up, basically, and have them be open to more risky, adult-oriented decisions.
Or gaming platforms and concepts.
Yeah, exactly. Just more adult concepts and not just the same Mario, Nintendo stuff that we're getting right now in real life.
I don't know. I mean, FF7's for Nintendo. That just that alone sounds fucking crazy. But,
yeah.
Well, Final Fantasy VI was for Nintendo, and Final Fantasy VI is arguably darker than 7.
Yeah.
That's true, but Final Fantasy VII did a better job presenting that darkness by virtue of being 3D. What if... Hold on. Final Fantasy VI was towards the end of the Super Nintendo's lifespan. If the disk drive comes up, what if 6 is also on
the
disk drive?
Nintendo.
What if 6 becomes the first... Final Fantasy VI is the first 3D Final Fantasy.
No, that would have taken too much foresight.
I think it was
development cycle. They never would have gotten it out in time.
But I think they still could have put it on disc. And the cartridge did limit the creation of Final Fantasy VI in a small way. They still fit in everything that they wanted to, but there were holes in the game that could be
and
easily
it's not
exploited.
that ridiculous a timeline. When did 6 come out?
I think
remember, honestly.
The most I think they would have done was release Final Fantasy 3 here in the States for Super Nintendo, and then for the Nintendo PlayStation they would have released an Ultimate Edition that has maybe an extra dungeon and some fucking cutscenes, some anime cutscenes or something.
It is pretty
disc based.
It is pretty tight. It came out in 1996.
Yeah.
But this was supposed to start this was being worked on and supposed to come out in 1992.
Right.
So it would have been, Final Fantasy VI would have come out 2 years after the PlayStation.
So.
And.
Yeah.
I don't know. If it hadn't fallen through, they might have courted Squaresoft on this.
Yeah.
So I think that the first Nintendo PlayStation would have done so well that they would have ended up merging, and then we would have seen a second Nintendo PlayStation, a Nintendo PlayStation 2 or something.
Yeah, there might have been
honestly, I think that it would have been so good that I think that when Sega does pull their trump card and bring out the Dreamcast, that I don't think it would have looked as impressive. I think that Sega would have folded earlier.
Yeah, honestly, in that situation, I believe Sega does fold earlier.
Sega folds in 98 when they can't compete with the 1997 release of PlayStation 2.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that much of a powerhouse, those two powerhouses together with that much development potential, and Sony being the innovator that they are, and Nintendo having the brands that they have, I feel like if the personalities mesh, as Ian's saying, if the personalities mesh and Sony's still trying to push but is held back only a little bit, and Nintendo is flexible enough but still has control of their first party franchises, how do you stop that?
Yeah.
Because I think what happens is Sega becomes Sony. I think that because almost all of the poor decisions that Sega makes are predicated on them not foreseeing the future of 3D. And like, as long as the Genesis was capable of being good enough to compete with the regular Super Nintendo before the disc drive comes out and starts doing that, then Sega has plenty of time to see that the disc drive is catching on and people are liking it, and instead of wasting a ton of fucking dev money, like, the Sega engineers at the time were actually really clever dudes.
Yeah.
Sega had plenty of perfectly good engineers that could make really powerful, really good computers. They just wasted all their effort on a product that was like upgrading sprite technology when they should have been doing polygons.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And so
I think that they could have, if they had refocused their energy, they might have been able to get the Dreamcast out in 94 or 95, which really would have fucking changed things.
Yeah, if Dreamcast comes out that early, before the Nintendo PlayStation merger even comes out with something the quality of the 64, like even before a 64-bit system, because in this situation they're at a 32-bit system, they would have to jump the gap to 128.
Right.
So there's one thing that really, really depends, and Sega's biggest problem isn't like hardware. Mm-hmm. It's getting games on their system, getting third-party developers, putting out enough first-party titles, and what that really, really hinges on is how advanced or not advanced is the Dreamcast when it debuts compared to other rivaling systems. Will third parties jump to the Dreamcast when it comes out? And if it's more powerful and just another jump compared to everything else that's out, that like it was when it originally debuted, in our timeline, then people aren't going to really develop for it right away because, why would you when there's already a PlayStation and a Nintendo 64 to develop for? So that's what happened with the Dreamcast. I think that if that happened again, it would just happen again.
But there's not already a PlayStation so what I'm saying is that the regular I think that Dreamcast maybe isn't as powerful as the Dreamcast we got, but it's somewhere between the Saturn and the Dreamcast.
So what I'm saying is if it's maybe about as powerful as the Nintendo PlayStation 2 or whatever, and it's both disc-based, third-party developers could be like, oh, well, we can easily develop for both of these, no problem. The Dreamcast is only like a little bit more advanced or whatever.
I think I see what you're saying. So
it depends
on how, if they don't make it far enough ahead of the PlayStation, then it suffers from never reaching its potential.
Yeah.
If they make it too far ahead, then people don't want to put in the effort to make complicated games.
What I'm saying is, because when I said that the Dreamcast wouldn't look as impressive, isn't because that the hardware wasn't impressive, because it was when we got it.
Yeah, if you jump too far ahead in technology, people just are like, we don't know how to work with this yet. Like, we can't make something quality for it.
That's true. That's what happened in the real world with the PlayStation 3.
Yeah. So Dreamcast, so Sega does what Eddie says and comes out with the Dreamcast faster, and it is far ahead technologically compared to whatever.
But third parties are like, why would I start developing for you when there's a Nintendo PlayStation to develop for, which has all of the install base?
Yeah, it has the install base. Plus, it's way less expensive to develop for this system than it is for your system, which doesn't have the install base.
There's proven techniques and systems. We know how to develop for it.
Exactly.
It's got power that we haven't pushed it to yet.
And honestly, trying to develop the Dreamcast early like that would just be more expensive for them to develop in the first place, which is why they'd end up folding even faster.
That's fair.
I guess that's fair.
And if you make a system that powerful that early, it becomes, maybe it's not a reason, like maybe it's a $500, $600 system in the mid-90s, and it just goes the way of the Jaguar.
Yep.
So I think that pretty much concludes the Nintendo PlayStation is successful, and Sony
so basically Sony Nintendo take over everything.
Yeah,
Microsoft jumps in at some point and is, I feel, if in that situation where Nintendo has already pushed out Sega and then Microsoft tries to jump in, Microsoft has the same problem that Sega had. Like, they have to get an install base ahead of Sony Nintendo.
Okay, so I just want to say, so if I'm understanding our agreements right, it's 2015. This is the history that we've had. The gaming landscape is that Sony and Nintendo have put out a gaming console that is basically like the PlayStation 4 plus the Wii U.
Yes.
And Microsoft has the Xbox One, and it's either both of the things or just the Microsoft thing.
Yeah.
And Microsoft isn't completely dead.
Yeah, I don't think Microsoft would have died. I think Microsoft has too much money to be forced out of something that they want to be in.
But they like Microsoft doesn't want to be in games for the sake. Like nobody, none of the executives throwing money at the gaming system is at Microsoft because they are passionate about video games. They are passionate about money.
Yeah,
and they think it's profitable. If they had to compete with this Sony Nintendo amalgam for 12 years entirely on their own, 20 years almost, they might not have made it through the original Xbox era.
I feel honestly like gamers, we need to have at least 2 consoles.
Yeah.
Like, I feel that if Nintendo Sony becomes this powerhouse, that there's still going to be that group of people who are hipsters, who are like, I'm not a fan of Sony and Nintendo. They're too big and corporate. I'm going to go with Microsoft, who's still really ridiculously big and corporate. And so that's stupid, but hipsters.
Yeah.
They want to go with Microsoft because Microsoft is the underdog. So they support the underdog.
All right. So alternate history, it's 2015. You've got the Nintendo PlayStation 5 and the Xbox One.
Yeah,
probably still.
It's probably still.
Honestly, I think it really depends on just how gimmicky Nintendo decides to be. I feel like a lot of the reasons why Nintendo has been gimmicky and are present is because they had to
they had
to carve out their own path because everything else was already taken.
Well, they couldn't technologically compete either, but with Sony's backing, they could.
I don't know.
So,
I think that a lot of their decisions in the 90s with things like the Rumble Pack, the motion controls for the 64.
I think that Nintendo would still try to innovate no matter what.
Yeah, Miyamoto just likes innovation too much. He's got a hard-on for it.
I think what would happen is that as we already know, Microsoft is not an innovator.
No, they kind of are a copier.
And I think that we would get a super powerful Nintendo, PlayStation, Wii U, whatever, that's like innovative and powerful and awesome, assuming you like those kind of gimmicks. And Microsoft would be like, hey, remember when gaming was cool and it wasn't about gimmicks? And that's how Microsoft gets their audience.
That's kind of funny, actually.
That'd be so weird.
That would be such a weird. Super weird. But
anyway, we've already been going for 40 minutes. What happens when the Nintendo PlayStation just fucking fails because it's terrible because they put out a fucking disc-based system in 1992, and what the hell is wrong with you?
So Sony decides to not do video games ever again.
Yeah, Sony didn't believe in video games.
Yeah, they already thought it was a bad idea.
Yeah, overall, Sony higher-ups didn't think it was a good idea. Ken Kutaragi was only able to do any of this because of Nintendo's like attempts and their failures and whatnot, and like one other guy at Sony who believed in him.
Yeah, so they feel like they've been proven wrong about like entering video games, so they decided to just back out, and we never get PlayStation, we never get Sony anything.
Right. And Nintendo feels like they get proven that disc-based games are not the wave of the future, and they hold on to cartridges probably longer.
I think that having failed with that, they might still attempt the Nintendo disk drive themselves.
And it would still fail because they wouldn't have
I don't
someone
see
like
why.
Sony.
With Sony doing it, when Sony built it for them and it fails, I don't see why Nintendo does. Because Sony, even with the PlayStation to compete against, Nintendo stuck with the N64 being cartridge based.
Yeah. I agree. I think Eddie's right where they do support cartridges longer. I think eventually they do get forced to go into discs because of the fact that memory. But I think that the GameCube is not a disc-based console. I think the GameCube is still cartridge-based, and maybe they don't switch to discs until something like the Wii U. But another thing that I think, though, is that we don't get the innovations that Nintendo gave us because they have no reason to anymore. They don't have Sony pushing the boundaries of game design as far as what they can do with the controller. So they're the innovators in that space now. Now Nintendo is pushing what you can do with the controller and the basic inputs that you have. And they don't need to innovate. They don't need to do gimmicky motion controls.
I'm going to say Nintendo still needs to innovate because I think that Sega would have learned from Nintendo and Sony's mistakes with making disc-based systems. And I think that Sega wouldn't have spent nearly as much time as they did fucking up disc-based games.
trying to make a disc-based system that is also a sprite-based system.
Yeah, so you think that basically that Sega slows down with innovation, but still keeps pushing forward slowly?
I think that Sega would take things a little slower and be a little bit smarter about it. I think that... we might have still gotten the Saturn, but I think that it wouldn't have been as bad. I think they would have had a stronger hold on how everything would work a little bit after watching Nintendo and Sony.
And the Saturn wouldn't have to compete with the PlayStation.
No, it wouldn't.
So
it would just have to compete with the N64, which may look wildly different.
Which is all the more reason for that Sega would be able to take their time and get it done right, is because there's not quite as much pressure as there was in our president.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit though about the fact that you were something that you said when you were just talking was that they would take their time. Another way to see people taking their time though is people slowing down innovation and not pushing the boundaries of what systems can do, being completely risk averse.
Right.
And because of something as big of a failure as the Nintendo PlayStation would have been considered, like right now in our current timeline, I feel like the industry is fairly risk averse. They stick with sequels and they don't try things new a whole lot, but they do at least try a little bit because they know that if they don't, someone else is going to first.
Yeah. Right.
But with just Nintendo and Sega in it and that big of a failure looming over the gaming industry, why do they push the boundaries and innovate? Like, unless people are no longer buying what they're selling, they don't have to. And so I think the progression to when we get to the type of games that we have now is so much longer. Like, I don't think we would be at this point as far as graphics and gameplay goes without the competition between Sony and Nintendo and Microsoft.
I disagree. Nintendo's no stranger to failure. I think that in the wake of that failure, that would just push them even harder to innovate even greater. Because they have to prove that video games are fun and can be played in fun ways.
Right.
Even if they fail one time, they'll just go back and do it again.
And so I'm going to throw you another hypothesis that might throw a whole other wrench into this.
Is it that the Virtual Boy is a huge success?
No, that's the Virtual Boy was never
in none of these timelines is the Virtual Boy a success.
The Virtual Boy philosophically necessary. It is a philosophical necessity or a logical certainty that the Virtual Boy is a failure because it just doesn't make any sense. It
causes blindness.
Like terrible system. No, my hypothesis is there were a lot of the reason that Sony did so well in their PlayStation era is because they pulled in a lot of really talented people that were really passionate. Mark Kearney was a big part of that. Ken Kutaragi was a big part of that. So I think there's a good chance that if the Nintendo PlayStation fails, I don't think Ken Kutaragi loses sight on it. I think that he recognizes that there's a bunch of other factors in it. I think that Mark Kearney, who is a fucking brilliant ass developer and a bilingual and is a perfect person to mesh Western audiences and Eastern audiences and this kind of development cycle. I think that people like them, instead of going and just being like, well, that's it, we're not in video games anymore, I think they go work for Sega. And I think that that's what makes Sega become a much more innovative company, is that they are pushed forward by... They get the room to breathe and have some time to deal with it. And the people that really want to push video games forward just for the sake of doing it, go work for them.
So you say that those people aren't going to be stopped. Like, no. Because I think I kind of agree with you in that situation.
If the Nintendo PlayStation is a failure, that means the Super Nintendo is a failure, which means the Genesis killed it in the early 90s, which means Sega, instead of being broke in the mid-90s and struggling to pull together the money to build a good system, has all of the money they need to hire all of the creative people to develop awesome shit.
Well, wait, the Super Nintendo still happened regardless of the Nintendo PlayStation. Like,
right, but I think what Eddie's saying is kind of true for consumers in general, because if they see a part of something fail, people don't just see a part of it fail. So if they say, oh, Nintendo PlayStation was a failure, anything attached to Nintendo PlayStation's a failure. Like, why would someone want to go to a failing ship when Sega hasn't done anything wrong? Like, Sega's proven that they can keep going and shows, promise.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, you get what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
like the Super Nintendo still does pretty well. Like, it doesn't put... It's not the Wii U for Nintendo.
It doesn't put Nintendo out of business, but, like, I guess the thing I'm saying is it wasn't Nintendo that killed Sega. It was Sony.
Yeah.
And if Sony falls out of the deal, then Sega is able to hold up their ship more than long enough to pull the talent from the vacuum that is left by Sony's disappearance. And I think that they're still on a level with Nintendo, and they become the competitors.
Okay, go ahead, Ian.
I was
Sorry.
going to say, here's the thing, though, is that I think that Sega's still going to fuck up. Because Sega always fucks up. That's what they do. They look real promising, and then they fuck up somehow.
I'm going to go ahead and see if I can convince you otherwise in that. So Sega fucks up because they have people that weren't making smart decisions.
Yeah.
What Eddie's talking about is those people who made the good decisions at Sony, the Mark Cernys, the Ken Kutaragis.
Yeah.
They go to a place where they feel that they can still push the boundaries and innovate.
Exactly.
Nintendo doesn't want to pull anyone from outside because the last time they pulled someone from outside, look, it was the Nintendo PlayStation. It didn't do well. They failed.
Yeah.
So Nintendo keeps everything in-house. Sure, they still push the boundaries with who they have, but they keep it all in-house. And the Cernys and the Kutaragis and all of the other innovators that want to push things forward need to go somewhere. Sony's not there. There's a vacuum.
Sony's not there.
They go to
Nintendo
Sega.
doesn't give a fuck what they had to say because they've got Iwata and Miyamoto and all these fucking guys.
Yeah.
And Ken Kutaragi and Mark Carney and Shuhei fucking Yoshida go, because Shuhei Yoshida was on Ken Kutaragi's team at the time.
Yeah, they all go to Sega.
They all go to Sega and they say, "Hey, this whole thing didn't work, but we still believe in it. Will you give us a chance?"
Yeah.
And Sega goes, "Yeah, we'll give you a chance."
Yeah, I think that they do. I think that they're smart enough to know that these guys have experience in the industry. They look at the Nintendo-Sony partnership and say that, it was probably the fault of people on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
Not because neither one of the groups was talented. Probably both groups were talented, and it was business things that messed them up.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, Sega, I agree with Eddie. I think Sega does fill that void for people who want to innovate. And so Sega stops making bad decisions because the people who made the smart decisions for Sony are now making the smart decisions for Sega. And then I still think we have a vibrant console climate.
Right.
What do you think about Microsoft? Do you think they still show up?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that Microsoft still shows up because of the fact that there are two vibrant companies. Like,
Yeah.
Nintendo and Sony were both vibrant companies that were making money and profitable, and Microsoft sees that and they go, okay, we want to jump in.
Yeah,
Microsoft still sees Sega and Nintendo being profitable, and they're like, we don't have an American console now. No one's here in America.
Exactly.
So considering that, I think one of the first things that they would have tried to do is, I think they would have, at some point, they would have tried to develop a competing handheld system for Sega. Like, you competing with Nintendo, obviously.
The Kutaragis and the Mark and the
Yeah,
Carneys
yeah,
and them,
I
they
think-
would have tried to make a Game Gear that wasn't shit.
Yeah. And I think that Sega, with the experience with the Game Gear, would be like, hey, we saw what the problems were. We now see Nintendo's Game Boy. And
You think they don't make the PSP and it's not overpowered and kills battery the same?
Yeah,
And
so-
Yeah,
it's not
I think
just
that they
Game
make
Gear version 2.
I
Yeah,
think they
so-
make something a little more moderate.
Yeah, so I was going to say, imagine the PSP and the Vita if it had Sega first-party titles.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Like, especially if, okay, here's the real question though. Like, this is the big one right here. Does Sonic still suck?
I mean...
Not with Mark Carney behind it.
I think that Sonic stopped sucking because I think that they bring someone in.
Mark Carney worked on Star Fox 2. And
I was going to say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
I don't know. I don't know. What happens when Naughty Dog develops Sonic Adventure?
Oh my
instead
god,
of
that is the
fucking-
best thing in the world.
Mark Carney's like, hey, I know these guys in fucking
So we
Southern
get-
California that
So
are
we
really
get,
creative.
So we get Sonic Boom a decade early, or at least his character design a decade early.
Sure, we get his character design, but we get him moving the proper way. We
Yeah,
get
yeah.
him moving through more interesting environments.
We don't get the weird get the weird division between Western and Eastern Sonic, and maybe somebody goes, let's actually take the comics and make them have to do with the games.
I don't know. I mean, let's not forget Sonic Boom actually was developed by ex-Naughty Dog employees. So, I mean...
Yeah, but it was developed by we don't know if it was developed by the people that quit Naughty Dog or the people that got fired from Naughty Dog.
That's a good point. So, like, I don't feel... Like, the only one that I feel hinders the game industry at all would be if Nintendo and Sony are so successful that they push everyone out. Like, I think that's the only way that the game industry is hindered. But I honestly, in all three of these things, I don't see PC really changing much at all. Because PC has always kind of done its own thing. Like, it's been an outlier, and it's been more about what the community wants things to do.
Right.
Rather than what any one specific developer or company wants done with it.
Right.
So PC kind of stays the same no matter what, which really is what's going to push the innovation for everyone else.
And the one big question is the only way that PC changes is if consoles never quite recover from whatever the fuck happens with Sony and Nintendo, and they start to flounder, then people who like video games are forced to flock to PC, and there isn't a remember in the mid-2000s people said PC is dead.
Yeah.
If there's no PlayStation 2 or something similar that completely annihilates the market for video games, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, there's not that big PC video game revival, and we may never end up with all of the awesome things that we have.
I think
today.
you're right. The options are there's really three ways that this goes. Either the Nintendo PlayStation is successful, and then Nintendo and Sony just keep doing it, and all the histories of Nintendo and PlayStation kind of merge.
Unstoppable monster.
And it becomes an unstoppable monster. Sega dies, and maybe Microsoft tries to fill the gap of Sega.
Yep.
Or the Nintendo PlayStation is successful. Nintendo tries to overpower their control, and PlayStation breaks off anyway, still becomes a super powerhouse because Sony's awesome, and Microsoft eventually shows up when Sega inevitably dies.
Basically.
Or the final option,
from the truth.
not too far off from the truth, or the PlayStation is a failure. Sega recovers itself in the mid-90s and becomes the new Sony.
Yep.
And becomes the competitor to Nintendo's line of ridiculous, crazy ideas.
And Microsoft still comes in.
And is exactly the same.
Yeah. So like, even with the crazy, ridiculous possibilities of what could happen, we still end up with a gaming landscape that's really similar to what we have now, to be honest. Except for, in all of these situations, I feel Nintendo is a more vibrant company than they are right now. I think Nintendo, in all of these situations where they partnered with Sony, even whether it fails or whether it doesn't fail, I feel that Nintendo would be better off than they are right now. Not saying that Nintendo won't recover and do something awesome with their next system, because that still remains to be seen.
Yeah. Except that they said they weren't going to try to compete on a power level with the current gen systems again.
We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. But either way, I think this was a pretty fun trip into our time machine. But I like our time better than all of these situations, except for that Sonic is good. Like, I like the fact that in at least one of these timelines, Sonic is probably good.
Yeah, Sonic might have been still good, but
is FF13 still bad?
Probably.
Yeah, it's probably still terrible.
I legit think that Squaresoft just started to run out of ideas, and that's what happened there.
Yeah. So, anyways, this was fun. I like doing this.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll fire up the time machine again in the future.
If you guys are curious about any other video game what ifs and you felt like we did a good job evaluating, let us know in the comments on whatever your preferred vehicle for commenting is.
Yeah, where can we receive comments now?
Tweet us, Facebook us. If you watch this on YouTube, just comment below the video. If you listen to us on Podbean, you can comment on our Podbean site.
On iTunes, you can leave comments on iTunes.
On iTunes, you can leave the iTunes comments.
And you know what would be really great as well? Is if wherever you happen to hear this, you leave a 5-star review for us. Or whatever their maximum rating for us.
Yeah.
Give us one of those.
Just let us know. If you like this, just let us know that you liked it.
Yeah. And then, tell us what you want us to talk about next, or tell us if you think that there's any scenario where, you know, we still have Sega in it.
Or tell us how fucking stupid we are, and that totally what would have happened is that all of video games would have died a horrible death because Sony and Nintendo kept their promises to each other.
We don't need to tell them to do that. They're going to tell us that anyway. That's the internet.
That's okay.
What the internet does.
That's okay. Just let us know.
Yeah, just talk to us. Tell us what you think.
Anyway.
You have any final thoughts, Ian?
I'm really hungry for reals, and I don't want to eat Nocturok, so we need to wrap this up.
All right, guys.
That's
Thanks
going to
for
be the end of it
joining
then.
us.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.